Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to be talking about the 2020 U.S. primary Democrat primary, winning that primary, okay, and how winning that primary relates specifically to Dungeons and Dragons dice, and how at the end of the primary, when all the chips are down, and we're going to determine who the winner is for the 2020 U.S. presidential primary, which one of the 26 specific candidates are going to represent the Democrat Party, how that will be determined in essentially a random way that has probability put into the mix. All right, and I think this is a really good way to think about the election and to understand what's happening, and also to highlight what are factors that give a person a better chance, okay? So let me kind of lay out my analogy here. All right, so before I do that, I want to talk just a little bit about Dungeons & Dragons. So Dungeons & Dragons is an incredibly special game to me. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons since I was 12 in 1982. And I'm a dungeon master and a player. I've written articles on the topic. I would say I'm a D&D wonk, right? So the game, and one of the reasons why I invest so much time and energy and research into Dungeons and Dragons is, I think the best way to understand Dungeons and Dragons is it is an element of Americana. It's just like jazz or comic books or Coca-Cola. It was something that was invented right here in America, and it is purely American, and it's an export, from America to the world, and it's incredibly, and it is popular right now. Dungeons and Dragons is very niche. It's not as big. Baseball is another one. Jazz, comic books, baseball, Coca-Cola, all of these, and then Dungeons and Dragons. All of these are elements of Americana. Okay, Dungeons and Dragons is a fantastic game. I really love it. I highly recommend giving it a shot if you've never played it. The game came out in 1974, and today it's really only 45 years old. It was created by a gentleman by the name of Garibay, and it's really an incredible game. The game does struggle today with three major issues that keep it from growing large. And one of those is games generally take 4 hours, and campaigns can run months or years, which is a really strange play model for modern Americans. In addition to that, it requires 750 plus pages of reading to be a dungeon master. Being a dungeon master is incredibly difficult. And then the last part is Dungeons and Dragons is one of the last guardians of print. Okay, print is really under assault. Print books are becoming increasingly rare. So we're choosing in America what is worth printing. And guess what's worth printing anymore, right? It's Bibles, tabletop role-playing games, and comic books. And that's about the full list. There's not much left. And all of those grow increasing. And everything other than those three categories really are dying away quickly, all right? So thanks for your patience on hearing me out on Dungeons & Dragons. So let me talk about Dungeons & Dragons dice for a minute, because you need to understand Dungeons & Dragons dice to understand this analogy. But I really do think this is a powerful analogy for understanding an election and understanding what the candidates are going through, right? Okay, so Dungeons & Dragons dice, there are 6 different types. So when you play Dungeons & Dragons, every player needs a set of Dungeons & Dragons dice. Dungeons & Dragons dice are very, very unique. So the vast majority of you listening to this have played Monopoly at some point. You know what a D6 is, what a 6-sided die is. It's a cube and it has 6 sides, right? These are used in lots of different gambling games. They're used in lots of different board games, okay? But Dungeons & Dragons, it uses D6, right? But then it uses 5 other types of dice that are pretty rare and that are seen in very, very few other areas in normal life, or even in very many other games, okay? That's a D4. A D4 looks like a pyramid, and it has 4 sides. A D6, we've already talked about that one. It's a standard die. You see it in many, many games. A D8 has 8 sides to the dice, 1 through 8, right? A D10 has 10 sides to the dice. A D12 has 12 sides to the dice. And a D20 has 20 sides on the dice. And that's it. That's all the dice there are in a set of Dungeons & Dragons dice. There's 6 different types: D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, D20, okay? Now, here's what I'm positing. I'm positing that basically every single candidate starts with a D4, okay? And basically every candidate at the end of the primary is going to roll the die that they have and try to get the highest number, okay? Now, every candidate starts with a D4, okay? And then by doing certain things or by being certain things, they can get +1s as a dice step. Now, in Dungeons & Dragons, when you have a dice step, you change the dice that you are rolling, right? So if you have let's say you're trying to determine your hit points, okay? Hit points are how many points a character has before they're knocked out, right? So if you roll a D4 for your hit points, you could roll a 3, right? That you could have rolled a 1, 2, 3, or 4, but let's say you roll a 3. Let's say you roll a D8, and now you have a 7, right? So basically, that's what I'm saying is at the end of the primary, every candidate is going to have a D4 to a D20, and what determines what type of die they'll roll, to win the primary, is who they are and what they've done. Right, and the reason why is who they are and what they've done gives them steps, right? It will increase or decrease the dice that they're going to roll at the end of the primary to see who has the number, who has the highest number, and whoever has the highest number is going to win it. I really think this is a powerful way to think about the analogy. One of the reasons why is one of the things to realize is you can't go below a D4 and you can't go above a D20. So even if you have a whole bunch of steps that would take you over a D20, I don't think in this election anybody's going to have anything but one die, right? And you max out at a D20 and you minimum out at a D4, okay? So let's talk about the fast. So one, I want to talk about the different things that give steps, right? That take you from a D4 to a D6 or a D8, that increase you from a D8 to a D10, that kind of thing. So let's talk specifically about these factors that give dice steps. All right, so just understand every candidate is starting with a D4, okay, and they're going to roll a D4. All right, so what are some of the things that change your dice step, right? Well, here's a good example: Washington Insider. If you are a Washington Insider, you get one die step. You go from a D, you get +1, okay? So a +1 die step from a D4 to a D would be going to a D6, right? And I think Washington Insider is a great and a powerful way to understand a die step. It gives you a +1. It increases you. Let's say you were at a D8, and then, we determine you are a Washington Insider. That would take you to a D10, right? So Washington Insider is +1 die step. Now, this next one is very, very sad. I think AWM, Eric Stallwell came up with this term, and self-labeled himself an AWM. We've had 43 AWM presidents, and that's definitely a +1, right? It absolutely shouldn't be, but it's very, very clear that it is, right? So that's a +1. Shouldn't be that way, but it is. It's one of those harsh realities of life. We as a nation are struggling, so that is +0. Now, this is interesting. It is possible. Just be aware, there is a distinct possibility that within the Democrat Party, AWM is a -1 die step. That seems like it's increasingly becoming the case, right? AWM should be +0. It should not give you any points, and it shouldn't take any away from you. But it's just kind of it's a political reality right now. It's a very significant issue, right? All right. Here's an interesting one. Ivy League. Did you graduate from an Ivy League school? If you did, +1. Okay. Here's another one. Execution. How well are you executing political craft? +1 if you are executing well. If you're executing well. All right, then we're going to talk about inaccuracies, mistakes, and blunders. This is a favorite term of mine from chess. In chess, if you make an inaccuracy, that means you could have made a better move, right? It doesn't lose you the game. It doesn't lose you the game. It just means you could have made a better move, right? A mistake is when you go from winning to becoming even, and a blunder is when you go from winning the game to losing the game. Okay, so inaccuracies are +0. Tons of, I think almost every candidate is making inaccuracies almost every single day, and that's okay. There's almost always, a better move that you could have made. There are some politicians who are really good at almost never making inaccuracies. Mistakes. There are absolutely circumstances where mistakes are being made, and then where you say something that clearly sounds terrible. You have to explain it. You spend a lot of time dealing with gotcha media over a soundbite went wrong, right? And then a blunder is when you really mess it up and you say something that could literally lose you the primary, right? So that's a blunder, and that's so +0 for inaccuracies, +0 for inaccuracies, -1 for a mistake, and -2 for a blunder. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the Fast Five, and let's actually calculate each one of their dice that they will have at the end of the election. Now, we can't know we don't fully know the inaccuracies, the blunders, the mistakes and the blunders they're going to make. So we're not going to talk about those individually. I could do an entire video on the mistakes and blunders that each candidate has made, but they're going to continue to make them, right? And I will say this, the media is so gotcha, right? Like there's so much gotcha media going on, gotcha journalism going on, that it is possible that, even though all these candidates have these +1s, the media is so vicious and is so interested in blood on the floor that, and just lap it up. Oh my gosh, they're so bad about it. That every candidate could end up with a D4, even though they have all these pluses that I'm going to talk about. So let's talk about what candidates get pluses going in. All right. So let's talk about Biden. All right. Biden is specifically, he has a D4, right? He is AWM, that's +1, right? Execution, absolutely not. He is not executing well, and so he would not get that +1. Oh, by the way, there's one more plus. Biden is very, very interesting. Incumbency is a +5. You go from D4 to D6 to D8 to D10 to D12, right? To D20, right? Like, it's being an incumbent takes you all the way from a D4 all the way up to a D20, right? So basically, Biden was already at a D6, going from an D4 gets an AWM, that's a +1, that's a D6, then gets a +5 for incumbency, right? Taking him all the way up to a D20, right? But and he actually even loses one die step because you can't go above D20. There's just no die higher than a D20 in Dungeons and Dragons dice, right? Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. So, in addition to that, you have he is a Washington insider, so that would take him. But he's still capped at a D20, right? And I think this is very real. Like, there's a point where all your extras just kind of pile on, and you don't get any more benefits. I think that's a very real thing. Okay, and then of course he's going to have his inaccuracies, his mistakes, and his blunders, right? All right. So basically, it's really quite likely that Joe Biden will be rolling a D20 when it goes to determine who will represent the party at the end of a primary, unless he creates a whole lot of mistakes and blunders, okay, which is quite possible. All right, let's talk about Elizabeth Warren. +1, she's a Washington insider. +1 execution. She is executing her political craft extremely well. So she went from a D4 to a D6, and now she's going to a D8, right? And I think that's pretty much it. That's it for Elizabeth Warren. She's going to be rolling a D8 when we get to the final. Finals, right? Let's talk about. By the way, I'm saving the best for last of the Fast Five, which is Sanders, Biden, Harris, and Warren, and Andrew Yang. All right. So let's talk about Kamala Harris. Right. She is a Washington. She actually is not really. Yeah. She is a I think she's either a congresswoman or senator. She absolutely qualifies as a Washington insider +1, right? And the reality is, I don't like to say this, but I think she's also executing well overall. She goes to a D8 as well. So I think that Harris and Warren both are going in with D8s. Biden has a D20. Let's talk about Sanders, okay? AWM, that takes him to a D6. Then in addition to that, he is absolutely a Washington insider. That takes him to a D8. He is executing well, without a doubt. He is executing well. That takes him to a D10, right? So I think Sanders is going to be rolling a D10 when he comes to the end of the primaries, right? Now, we've talked about Biden, we've talked about Sanders, we've talked about Harris, and we've talked about Warren. Let's talk about the very best of them, Andrew Yang, all right? So Andrew Yang is really interesting. So, so basically, Andrew Yang, he is executing well, okay? So that takes him from a D4 to a D6. He is not a Washington insider. He does not get those points. He is not an AWM. He does not get those points, all right? So far, all he really has is his execution points, and he stands at a D6, right? Now, get this. We talked about Ivy League. Andrew Yang is the only member of the Fast Five that has an Ivy League degree, okay? So I know what you're thinking. You're thinking he's going to get a +1. He's not. He's going to get a +2. Here's why. Andrew Yang is double Ivy League. He has 2 Ivy League degrees, right? So the first Ivy League degree takes him from D6 to a D8, and then his second Ivy League degree takes him from a D8 to a D10. And also, just so you're aware, this proves without a doubt that that Andrew Yang is by far the best educated of the Fast Five. Nobody's even close. In fact, none of the other candidates have any kind of schools that compete in any way with the Ivy League except one, which is Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is a Howard University graduate, and Howard is really special. It's not Ivy League, but it really is an incredible school. I bicycle a lot. I go down to Washington, D.C., and I almost always stop at Howard University because the people are really nice and they have really good food down there. And I really have a special place in my heart for Howard. And I think it's, Howard is an awesome university, but it don't give you a +1. Not like Ivy League is Ivy League. Come on, let's not pretend, right? All right, so with that said, it's when it comes to education, it's Andrew Yang way, way up, right? And then Kamala Harris went to the awesome school of Howard University, and all the rest of those candidates went to a bunch of scrub schools, just like me, right? Like I went to Millersville University and University of Phoenix, and I love those schools, but they're not Ivy League. Let's not pretend. All right, just like I went to scrub schools, just like Warren and Biden and Sanders, right? All right, but that means that Andrew Yang is going in with a D10, right? So Warren and Harris are both going to be rolling D8s. Andrew Yang is going to be rolling a D10. Biden is going to be rolling a D20, right? And then Sanders, he was Washington, he was executing, and he's AWN. And Sanders will be rolling a D10 as well, right? So here's the kicker, right? Let's say that all of them were to make no mistakes and no blunders. That means what's going to happen is Warren and Harris are going to roll D8s. The max number they can get is an 8, okay? Sanders and Yang are going to roll D10s. The max number they can get is a 10, right? And then finally, Biden is going to roll a D20, right? Now, and so, these are the categories I made, and we're dropping each one of these. We're looking at the primary as though at the end, each candidate rolls their Dungeons and Dragons die, their one die type, okay? And the reality is, I think that's pretty accurate, right? Because the reality is, there's a really strong chance that Biden's going to roll an 11 And that's it. He just walks away with the whole thing. Doesn't matter what anybody else rolled because their dies aren't even high enough to catch him. But there's also a possibility that Biden rolls a 3, right? And that, Andrew Yang rolls a 9, and that Sanders rolls an 8, right? And that and that Harris rolls a 4, right? And then that Warren rolls a 6, And so that's the thing is, I think this is a really strong way to look at the probabilities. And when we look at, these what causes a die step, it really gives you those categories, right? And you could really see clearly what really helps people in the primary, right? AWM, super sad. That should not help anyone. I think unfortunately it does help. There's a big question of whether the pendulum is swinging to the point where it's actually a negative. That's possible. That is possible. It's a really interesting conversation. Incumbency is incredibly powerful. Biden, I honestly think Biden would not even be he wouldn't even be a viable candidate if not for his service with Obama. But he did have his service with Obama. It's really, really super important. And you could see how much of an advantage it gives him, right? Ivy League, it's a big one, right? It's a really significant, right? Washington Insider, it gives people an advantage, and also, but it also just shows us, as you're moving along and you're doing your best to really, excel and do well, in these elections. At the end of the day, you're going to get a die and you're going to roll your die and you're going to have the best. You're going to have, you're going to do the best you can to get there. But it also, things are stacked, right? Like, Biden's going to roll in there with a D20 in hand. And it's very likely that Yang and Harris are gonna Yang and Sanders are gonna be the only ones with D10s, and that Warren and Harris are really gonna have D8s. So you see this probability where anybody can win, but the reality is not everybody has an equal chance, right? So we definitely have work to do on our system. It's still the best political system in the world. That's my analogy. I think it's pretty accurate. I'd love to hear if you think I'm right or wrong. Let me know if you think there's a better way to explain, what's going to actually happen at the end of the primaries and how to understand, how these candidates are actually. What's a good, strong analogy where you can kind of boil down what's happening so it's accessible and easier to understand, and it gives illumination on the elements that are important in the election itself. I'd love to hear your analogies. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.